Welcome to Claims and Sustains, a Seyfarth government contracts blog, where we are breaking down the world of federal contracting with as little jargon as possible. My name is Barney, and I am joined by my colleague Zohra Tejani, and today we are tackling a pretty big question. What should commercial contractors consider if they are thinking about doing business with the federal government?
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, it's a big topic. And to answer that, first of all, it's about the business and the scope of this customer. It's the federal government is the largest buyer in the U.S., and that means thinking about a market of consistent demand, steady revenue, and long-term projects. So in terms of putting a number to that, the GAO published that last year the U.S. federal government spent $755 billion on contracts. I had to read that correctly, for goods and services. So you can see that would be a compelling reason.
Yeah, it's not a number to turn your nose up at.
No, not at all.
And I think there's maybe a misconception that government contractors are these like big monolithic companies that only do government contracts. But I think the best kept secret in federal contracting is that the federal government has programs that specifically set aside contracting opportunities for small businesses. And sometimes this even means sole source opportunities. So federal contracting can be a great way for smaller businesses that are looking to grow, or I think proving capability. It's another way to maybe get into new markets as a small business that you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, well, completely. And for this episode, we are going to focus on companies, small and large, who already have an established commercial product and are in the marketplace. There's so many considerations already for us to address in this episode, but there's a whole nother set when you're startup and in that earlier development of your product and that innovation life cycle. So what we're really going to focus on today are those big rock issues for companies, large and small, who have commercial products and services.
And I think Zohra covered a lot of like the sunshine and roses aspect of doing business with the federal government, but there's a reason not everybody does it. And I think one of the big reasons is that it is such a highly regulated field. And the source of these regulations and these obligations can be really complicated, and they can change very quickly, which can make it difficult for contractors who aren't already read in or who are trying to kind of catch the train to really fully wrap their arms around them. It's also a pretty high stakes world. So in the commercial world, things like breach and misrepresentation and default all have their consequences, but the stakes are even higher in the federal world because you are dealing with contractor money. And I think a theme throughout this episode will be that it does require a certain amount of commitment. Commercial contractors have to decide that doing this kind of business is something they're willing to invest in because it's not really something you dabble in. And the acronyms. It's like learning a whole new language, which hopefully we can help demystify a little bit for you today.
Absolutely. And so even though there is this alphabet soup, there is good news for commercial companies wanting to, engage in business with the federal government, and it's by the very nature of the product being commercial and the government treating that as its own category. So why don't we dig into that first?
That sounds great.
All right. So one benefit of providing commercial products and commercial services is the deference the U.S. federal government pays to commercial terms. So of course, there are plenty of provisions that the government will say are unenforceable for a variety of reasons. And not that the government doesn't have its own terms. There are plenty of those. However, in the grand scheme of things, there is a deference to those commercial terms that you might not otherwise see or expect from the federal government. And they certainly don't afford that same deference to companies who are traditional government contractors and whose primary market is federal government contracting. So with that, there will be opportunities to leverage those commercial terms And so do you want to share maybe another benefit, Sarah, of for commercial companies?
Absolutely. So the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which we will touch on a little bit later, defines commercial products and commercially available off-the-shelf items very broadly. So a lot of things can fall into those buckets. And I think that kind of goes to your point, Zohra, of the government wanting to capitalize on the fact that there is this existing market of commercial products and wanting to meet commercial contractors. We won't say in the middle because maybe that's giving the government too much credit, but give them some amount of deference. And so as a result, the contracts for those commercial products and cost items generally waive some of the more odious restrictions, such as the cost and accounting standards or requiring contractors to hit certain subcontracting goals. And so as a result, I think it's fair to say that it's a lighter lift for commercial products.
Yeah, and for commercial companies, who are just not going to have those financial systems in the example that you gave, Sarah, so for cost accounting systems, it's just an entirely different framework in which to, run your company. So certainly those kinds of things are not going to apply in most cases. So it is that lighter lift. So having these types of exceptions is one of the ways the government tries to make federal contracting more accessible. And so with that, shall we talk about compliance?
Absolutely. Well, I feel like we've talked about compliance as kind of the big, scary, what's behind the secret door. So why is compliance such a big deal in federal contracting?
I mean, at its foundational level, is it because we're talking about taxpayer dollars, all of the money that we pay into the federal government, that's what we're talking about in terms of coming back in the form of contracts and the funds that go with it. And because of that, there is a natural stewardship that has to happen with those funds, not to mention all the laws and separation of powers and all of the foundational elements of the way our government was formed really translates into how those dollars are appropriated and then spent. And so accordingly, there's lots of strings attached to those funds. And because of that, there are important statutes like the False Claims Act that establish the framework for enforcing when there's fraud or misrepresentation in the context of a federal contract. So I think that is really an important one to take a moment and talk about a little bit. And from there, it's important to know, if you're new to this area, that private citizens can stand in the shoes of the government and sue to enforce procurement fraud under the False Claims Act, and that's sometimes a surprise for folks who are new to this sector. And so it really makes the stakes all that more higher.
I think high stakes is a great way of putting it, and I think especially with kind of the whistleblower aspect that you raised. Zohra and I were talking earlier about how it can seem like if you're a small business flying under the radar, why would you have to worry about these kind of big statutes? Why would the government come after me? But the government has consistently indicated that using the False Claims Act as a mechanism for weeding out fraud is a priority. In fiscal year 2024, the government recovered $2.68 billion in False Claims Act recovery. So it is not something to be ignoring. I think it's also worth noting that federal procurement is a real policy tool, that we see from administration to administration different priorities, whether they're national security or domestic sourcing or some kind of socioeconomic initiative, be put forth through what requirements are put on federal contractors. So when you're entering this realm, you are also kind of entering the realm of whatever policy rules the day, which is a great thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I love that point because it also reminds us of how much this world evolves. You think it's very static, or it's really not.
Sometimes you wish it was really static.
Yes, we do. So perhaps this is a good opportunity to talk about some of the other considerations, like the legal types of topics that might come up in the context of doing business, and that might even could be an underpinning for one of those fraud claims we were just talking about.
Absolutely. So you'll see quite a few kind of repeat sources of obligations in federal contracting. Federal statutes create kind of the big framework, and they will govern a variety of things like competition in contracting. What will probably get the most mileage in the federal contracting world is regulations, specifically the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR as it's commonly known. Timestamping that as of September 2025, the FAR is undergoing some pretty significant revisions. So don't hold us to anything that we've said too specifically. The FAR also has agency-specific supplements, the defense FAR being one of them, or the DFARs. And these regulations will have everything from how a competition has to be run in a solicitation to what clauses need to end up in the ultimate contract. So there's a lot of meat in those regulations. And then I think finally something we've seen more commonly in the past couple of years is the use of executive orders to kind of guide different procurement requirements. And I think that is a place where procurement policies change like overnight and can be really hard to keep up with if you don't know where to look.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. Okay, so with that, why don't we get a picture of these issues overall, so folks can kind of get a sense of how they fit in from a risk and revenue perspective. So we'll show you now an infographic that shows it's not just sales, contracts, and legal in your company who will have to wrangle with all of these various issues that we've been talking about, but it really impacts the whole company and various stakeholders within it. So you can see on the page as you're looking there about the different types of topics that can come up, whether they're blockers from a revenue perspective, in a blocker to get your product to the federal government as a customer, and then the other side is the compliance risk that we've been talking about. So this is, in this example, it's really the infographic is focused on technology and innovation and companies who are bringing that, but these issues give you a sampling of what any company with any kind of commercial product, commercial service might face.
And I think they're a good chorus on our theme of kind of being committed, to your point that making the decision to do federal business isn't something that you have to discuss with different siloed part of your companies. You kind of have to get everybody on board before you decide to move forward.
That's a fantastic point. And so you don't have to solve all of these issues day one, but in a certain amount of intentionality is a good idea.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's dig into a few of these. So what are the key compliance areas that commercial companies should know about when doing business with the federal government?
Absolutely. Well, there are quite a few, but let's start with cost and pricing. So as we indicated that certain aspects of cost and pricing, like the cost and accounting standards, won't apply to commercial product contracts. That being said, there might be certain scenarios like a sole source deal that does bring you under the land of CAS control. Notably under CAS, and it varies, there's a lot more nuance to it than what we'll walk out, but you'll need a system to track your allowable costs, your indirect rates, and you'll have to have records that are auditable. And I think this can be an area where being told what your system needs to look like and who should have access to it can feel pretty intrusive if you're a commercial contractor. But that is something when you're signing up for these opportunities to be keeping in mind. And so for our next bucket, Zohra, will you talk to us about cybersecurity?
Absolutely. This could also be its own episode, and maybe it should be given the current news. But let's talk about at least some of the baseline security practices, and those are starting out in FAR 52204-21. These are 15 very basic kind of cyber hygiene practices that most companies probably already have in place or should have in place, hence the clause being fairly basic. But if you're looking at DoD and national security customers, then you'll need a CMMC 2.0 certification. So to give you some context, for a level 2 certification, that would mean implementing the 110 controls of NIST Special Publication 800-171 and either self-assessing to those controls that have been implemented, or sometimes the procurement will require that you have a certified third-party assessing organization, I hope I got that right, to conduct the certification for you. And so there's a lot more to that as well, but being overly superficial with that topic. What's up next, Sarah?
So up next is supply chain considerations. And this is another area where there are some commercial carve-outs where it's not going to apply evenly across the board. But federal contracts have a variety of different sourcing regimes for domestic sourcing, Buy American Act, Trade Agreements Act, Build America, Buy America, all which could require you to either manufacture or source a certain amount of a product in the United States. Additionally, there might be more universal prohibitions on using certain sources. We see that in the Huawei restrictions that apply pretty much across the board. And I think that can be a place where knowing what you are currently doing, if you're looking to make the switch or kind of tap into the federal market, is really helpful to know what changes you might need to make. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about intellectual property. So, Zohra, how does intellectual property differ in the federal market?
Well, it's a major shift. Just the way the government even talks about this topic can be very different. Also very nuanced and detailed, high-stakes topic, which we will oversimplify for you right now. But the government can claim if something was invented with federal funds, can claim a property interest in that patent that was developed, and that's very different from commercial norms.
And so when you say data rights, that means rights in data, correct?
I see what you did there. Not exactly. When the government says data rights, they're talking about rights in technical data and computer software. I know. But in some cases, the government may actually require rights to use, reproduce, or disclose certain deliverables that contain copyrighted material or trade secrets of the company producing those. Generally speaking, the types of rights granted to the government differ based on whether the deliverables or what's being given to the government in that contract are commercial or other than commercial. But even for commercial products, companies who are starting out should know that there are times where the government will be entitled to broad rights to certain aspects of data, so technical data and computer software, in your commercial product that relate to interoperability or that could support a modular open systems approach. And so that's another massive change that folks may not be aware of, that's part of a contract that you could be granting those broad rights.
I feel like the description of this podcast is just asking Zohra to explain the most complicated topics in 100 words or less.
So you're welcome.
So we have to have talked about everything, right? There can't be anything else that federal contractors need to comply with.
So I think we have covered those big topics. And I think, to your point, this is really the tip of the iceberg. But it's meant to address what are some of those really big foundational topics that you want to go in with eyes wide open. And, but there are other ones that you might encounter from competition, conflicts of interest issues, physical security, national security, labor laws. Remember the infographic, lots of topics. And Sarah, so what are your thoughts and maybe some closing thoughts here?
Absolutely. I mean, I think another kind of facet of this is that while there are these kind of general requirements, a lot of the requirements are triggered by specific aspects of a contract, whether it's who the customer is or the contract vehicle they're using or the industry they're in. So I think part of the nuance is not just what's out there, but does it even apply to me? So that can be a tough place to start. I think it can be scary. It can be intimidating. We've obviously piled on a lot of what you will have to do, but Zohra, feasibly, there is a light at the end of this tunnel. There's money.
Yeah, to go back to the point that we opened with is that there is real money here. The federal government customer tends to be a good buyer and a good customer. And, right now in the current administration, there is a very, concerted focus on enhancing procurements with commercial companies. So that can be a really, opportune time to get started.
Absolutely. And I think there is there is a lot of guidance out there. I think
Yeah.
it varying degrees of usefulness, and of course taking everything with a grain of salt, because the application of these obligations are so fact specific. But you're not if you're starting from scratch, you don't necessarily have to be starting without some kind of guidance.
Absolutely. And it's an iterative process and a journey. There's so many ways to go to market in terms of the contracting vehicles and whether you go direct or indirect with partners and things like that. So there may be some growing pains, but I think once processes are established and you kind of have your go-to market in place, then it becomes easier.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us as we walk through the journey that is potentially becoming a federal contractor. We hope to speak on this more because obviously there's a lot to talk about. But thank you for joining this episode of Claims and Sustains.